Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Let's see if you can find a seat. Please find a seat. Please, may I have your attention? Okay. Oh, have I been looking forward to today? Have I? Dear EST President, Executive Board, and EST members, dear, you can't hear me? Are you sure you can't hear me? Okay, thank you. Okay, so dear EST President, Executive Board, and EST members, dear keynote speakers, participants and presenters, dear members of the Scientific Committee, dear sponsors and publishers, dear colleagues and friends. On behalf of the Aarhus Organizing Committee, I'm profoundly happy to extend a warm welcome to you all. We are truly pleased to finally have you here. The fact that we are able to gather well over 400 translation scholars from more than 50 countries for a congress with some 20 sponsors pays testimony to the significance and expansion of our discipline, translation studies, and to the importance of our society, the European Society for Translation Studies. I think we should all be happy and proud today. But then before I go into practical or even emotional details about the event ahead of us, I will leave the floor for a word of welcome from the Dean of Aarhus School of Business and Social Sciences at Aarhus University, Thomas Pallesen. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Dear guest, I leave the jacket. It's such a nice weather. Dear guest, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Aarhus University and the EST conference. It is great to see that the conference brings together academics and practitioners from across the country and the world, because in a collaborative exchange of knowledge and experience, the opportunity of moving boundaries, not only of translation studies, but of any study, becomes even more important. And combining the best of both worlds can provide beneficial insights and synergies in further development of the discipline. At Aarhus University, we strive to put our knowledge to use through close, enduring, and innovative relationship with the world around us, the business community, public authorities, organization, and society in general. Our knowledge exchange builds on the university's strong research foundation and interdisciplinary research collaboration, and contributes to find solutions to the challenges faced by society on local, regional, and global levels. Since its establishment in 1928, our university has grown to become a leading public research university with an international research, covering the entire research spectrum across our Faculty of Arts, Faculty of Science and Technology, Faculty of Health, and School of Business and Social Sciences. Each year, more than 7,000 new students start a degree program here. They encounter courses and activities that develop and challenge them across disciplines and national boundaries. The university offers over 200 degree programs and 4,000 courses, all aiming to meet the highest international standards. Today, 45,000 students are enrolled in the university, and we have more than 8,000 faculty and staff members employed, coming from more than 95 different nationalities. International collaboration is an integrated part of all activities at Aarhus University. We have a long-standing tradition of partnering with some of the world's best research institutions and university networks, and over the years, we have seen a considerable rise in the level of international mobility among our researchers and students. It is a trend we are committed to support and would like to see continue in the future. We pride ourselves in being a research-intensive institution of higher education among the best 100 universities in the world. The university defends the academic freedom of individuals and wants to maintain and develop a culture that promotes collaboration, critical dialogue, curiosity, and the independent search for new knowledge and insight. The strong research environments have also contributed to winning 2 Nobel Prize laureates in recent times. All of this testifies to our strong commitment to research and have an impact on the world around us. In all of our degree programs, research and education are closely combined to ensure the depth, quality, and content that reflects the latest scientific developments. This creates an inspiring academic environment where highly qualified researchers use their findings as a basis for teaching. We strongly believe that excellent research must be a foundation that ensures our graduates acquire competences which are valued by the labor market. All of this serves to strengthen our international competitiveness and increases our contribution to society. We exploit our strengths to consolidate our position as an attractive university for students and faculty. Although translation studies are not equivalent to language studies, language is an essential part of translation. I will therefore take the opportunity to mention that Aarhus University strategic focus on language as a means to strengthen our position in language research and education. The University Board decided in June of this year to approve a merger of business language with cultural language. The initiative was supported with €4 million from the university's strategic funds over the coming years. The reason for the merger is to strengthen the research core of our foreign language studies and to create the largest research environment in Scandinavia within this field. The purpose of the initiative is to improve our graduates' qualification even more. What we invest in our students' academic and professional development today is what graduates, employers, and society will benefit from in the future. I will conclude by wishing you a very productive conference. I hope that you will gain new insights and new collaboration across academia and the industry for the good benefit of translation research. I would also like to thank Professor Helle Rønning-Dam and the entire crew who have put lots of energy, thoughts, and hundreds of working hours in organizing this conference. Thank you very much. And to the rest of you, enjoy your time here in Aarhus, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So the next speaker needs no introduction. So here he is. Anthony Pym, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Helle. Good morning. Welcome to our Congress in Aarhus at last. On behalf of the Executive Board of the European Society of Translation Studies, of which I'm the outgoing president, I extend sincere thanks to Aarhus University and the Dean for this implicit support of translation studies and thereby translation and thereby the model of a multilingual pluralistic society, which is not just involved in language training for business, but also in maintaining a certain kind of human diversity. There are more profound things at stake. My sincere thanks to Helle and Karen and the entire organizing team. We'll have more occasion to thank them when we have seen what a success this Congress will have been. But I know how many hours of work have gone into this so far, and the success will be theirs. My thanks to the organizing team for the whole process. Since this was presented in Germersheim 3 years ago, we've been working not only on the logistics, but the topic, the theme of the Congress, which was part of the deal, has proved to be stimulating and timely, as we see by your presence and by the topics of many of the papers that are to be presented. The notion of pushing boundaries can be taken in several ways, though, and I want to pause personally to have a reflection on what that means. What does it mean to push a boundary? Implicitly, it's a claim to the occupation of intellectual space, perhaps to the exclusion or incurring the opposition of other disciplines. So it's not quite so easy as some of us imagine. Pushing a boundary might be simply referring to something that's happening in the world, new technologies and their consequences, and saying, oh, we can look at that. It might simply be redefining our basic terms. Translation now means this, before it meant that, and on we go. I think those are rather factitious strategies, easy to do, easy to sell within our particular coterie, but not easy when we enter into dialogue with other disciplines. If we want to push boundaries and occupy intellectual space, I suggest we have to do it along the lines of something like this: identifying new problems or new ways of solving old problems, and then showing that we can draw on the accumulated knowledge, models, research skills, and research tools that we have in our short history, that we identify as being ours, and showing that we can use what we have to do things, to help solve problems in the new terrain that is opening up. So please, don't take the topic lightly. Let's not just assume, oh, now we are bigger. We are bigger physically. We're overwhelmed by the success, the numbers of papers proposed for this Congress, the growth in membership. But we'll talk about that tomorrow. Yes, we're getting bigger. Yes, in our research community. But let's not assume that we automatically occupy new intellectual space. I wish you pleasant debates over the following days. Thank you.
As for the practical information screens in this building, displaying messages and announcements of events to come, there is one screen on each floor. We actually have 3 floors here. And we are on the second now, just to give you an idea, and then we have the first and the ground floor. We will also be posting old-fashioned paper-based messages on boards and walls in various places in and around this building. So please make sure to keep yourself updated via these channels and follow the signs when you move from one room or building to another. We also have a number of human information sources. The most important one, the heart and the nerve of the Congress, is the welcome desk. It's manned or womened, as Carol said yesterday, throughout the conference. That is the one that you have on the ground floor by the entrance where you came in. And down there they'll solve any problem or query you may have. We also have like somewhere between 10 and 25 student helpers at any given point in time, and they are all eager to help and very, very visible, I think, in their red t-shirt. That was the idea. So ladies in red dresses, sorry. I'm so sorry. Well, we chose red. Well, last but not least, we're a large group of local organizers. I have lost count. This is not, of course, true, but the composition of the group has changed considerably over the 4 years we've been preparing for this conference. Some have left, others have joined the group, and our young people have been on and off maternity leaves. In fact, a total of 6 babies have been born while we prepared for this conference. I think we may even see some of them today. But let us just see who the organizers are at this point. So I see some. Could I ask you to stand up, please? Local organizers, can you stand? Okay, local organizers. Do we have some of the administrative staff here? So we have all the local administrative. They're busy down at the welcome desk, are they? Okay, student helpers, let us see our assistants. You know, they would be like Isabella down here in a red t-shirt. So I'm sorry, so the ladies will not be wearing red tomorrow. So grab any of these people and and they'll help you with anything. Okay, then we have a lot of electronic information sources. They'll be really important during this Congress. To access the wireless internet, you can use either EduRoam, if you have it installed, or you can connect to the network that you have on the slide here. It's called AU Guest. And you just log in by following the instructions that appear on your screen. Also, I have given you the address of the conference website because there you can find the detailed program, so it's really important. You only have like an outline. Do you all realize that this is the program? Okay, and we have a code system with red dots and all sorts of dots that you'll figure out as we proceed, I believe. So the detailed program, the Book of Abstracts, is on the internet. And we will also use Twitter to communicate with you during the Congress, so follow us there if you're a Twitter person. So I want to pay attention to another detail, which is there at the bottom of here. There's a logo there. You know, generally this is a Congress with many sponsors, and the main conference sponsor, however, is Kommunikation and Sprog. This was, a little bit in Danish. It's a professional association and union that represents language and communication specialists of all kinds, translators and interpreters included. And it's of great symbolic value to have an organization of practitioners support this research conference. The representatives are here, as a matter of fact. I think I've seen Per and Jørgen. Are you here? I think you are there. Okay, so when you see them over lunch or coffee, go and congratulate them. They paid for your conference. Okay, I would also say a few words about the topic. So it is Translation Studies Moving Boundaries. The underlying idea, as you know from the call, is to discuss what is currently happening in translation studies and in the field of practice. With all these new concepts and notions and phenomena and practices as well that we see, such as transcreation, post-editing, revision, trans-editing, trans-languaging, and this is just to mention an unordered few. We also see concepts such as intralingual and intersemiotic translation. Also, they seem to be gaining ground, at least in some areas and among some scholars. And so the question that we pose here is how to deal with these trends. Are these concepts and practices really all translation, or are some of them, in fact, not translation? So this is where the question of boundaries or even borders come in. Where does translation studies begin, and where does it end, and does it end at all? Many of us will probably agree that borders are unwelcome, that they should be torn down, that barriers should be eliminated for unity and interaction to flourish. In translation studies, we have a history of counterproductive internal boundaries. One example, in my opinion, is the boundary between written translation and interpreting. Another could be the sharp distinction we often still make between conference and community interpreting, despite calls to the contrary. I also wonder about the barrier between literary and business or specialized translation. Is it really well founded? Another gap could be the one that we find between research and practice. Well, these are borders that should or could probably best be torn down. But on the other hand, we need borders or boundaries. We need to be able to define and not least delimit our field. Because as is commonly acknowledged in sociology, without borders, we have no community. We cannot not have borders and still have a community. So if we embrace all thinkable notions and phenomena under the term translation, for example, we risk losing our common core, that which unites us and sets us apart. So without borders, we would be left with nothing to gather around for congresses such as this one. And now to our hope and ambition for this Congress. It is that it will be fertile ground for lively discussions about these and other boundary issues in translation studies, conceptual, disciplinary, methodological, professional, geographical, you name them. And we hope that you will participate in all sorts of sessions, panel, paper, poster, plenary sessions, and in lobby, lunch, and dinner discussions. We hope that you will reunite with old colleagues and friends, and that you will meet new ones. But we also hope that you will just enjoy yourselves immensely. We used to say that Aarhus is the city of smiles. Our first keynote speaker, I'm not calling on you just yet, Andrew, is Andrew Chesterman. He has visited us several times here in Aarhus, and he uses to say that he comes here to get some good Danish laughs. And this is another ambition of ours for this Congress. Let us try to have some good laughs. Okay, before I give the floor to Andrew, I'd like to say just 2 words about our choice, or a few more, choice of keynote speakers. In previous EST congresses, it's been tradition to invite some keynotes from within translation studies, but also some from other, perhaps related fields, such as linguistics, semiotics, writing research, neurology, and so on. It's a very deliberate choice that the plenary speakers of this Congress are all from within translation studies. In choosing keynotes from our own field, we have, so to speak, opted for strengthening the basis rather than expanding the boundaries, which I say alluding to the title of one of the many interesting panels to come. Translation studies is often referred to as an interdiscipline. The point we wish to make is that the field has reached maturity, that it has become a discipline in its own right, with its own theoretical and methodological underpinnings, with authorities, even dinosaurs of its own. And one of the field's undisputed authorities is Andrew Chesterman. We all know him as an excellent scholar and speaker. He has written numerous widely read and cited articles and books, especially on translation theory or meta-translation studies. A particular favorite of mine is Memes of Translation. Andrew, I just looked it up. It's almost 20 years old now. It's from '97. It's still one of the best, really. Andrew is, of course, originally from England, but he has been based and been a professor in Finland for many, many years. I noted, Andrew, you came in '68. That's a magical year. Yeah, I want to know more about that. But Andrew is now retired in principle, but fortunately he continues to be active in our field. It took a little persuasion to make him speak at this Congress, but fortunately we were successful. The title of Andrew Chesterman's speech is Moving Conceptual Boundaries, So What? In his usual informal style. Andrew, please take the floor.
Well, good morning, everybody. Hope you're all warm enough. I want to start by thanking my hosts, Aarhus University and the Dean, and of course the Congress Committee and Mr. President of EST, and all of the EST Committee for organizing the conference. And I'm really very proud and humbled. Can you be proud and humbled at the same time? Maybe I can, to be asked to speak to you this morning. And I hope you won't be too disappointed. Let's see. I really want to say something very simple, and it has to do with a very general topic which has occupied me for many years, which is really the relation between concepts or conceptual ideas and empirical facts, or facts and ideas, to say it really simply. I'm interested in the way they interact, the way one depends on the other, and so on. And I'm going to focus this morning on conceptual boundaries, what happens when we try to move them. And the point I want to make is really a very simple point, which is this, that when we set out to move a conceptual boundary, when we make that proposal, I think it is our duty to point out not only what advantages this move might have, but also what the costs might be. Anthony mentioned just now that when one moves a boundary, it may be encroaches upon somebody else's territory, and there may be opposition, etc. And this is a point that I will come back to. I'm going to give various sorts of examples, and this is, roughly speaking, the structure of what I'm going to say. I'm going to start by outlining 3 or 4 different ways in which we divide up our stuff. This is stuff, right? And we divide it up and make sections and categories and the like out of it, and we create new categories and new names and so on. That will be the first chunk. And then I'm going to look at the way in which we try to see things differently in some innovative way by using different kinds of similarities and metaphors and so on, seeing something as something else. And then I will come back to the point about are all these proposals, such proposals, are we clear that they add value and that the added value is more important than the cost? And then finally, I'm going to look at some examples of what I call risky rhetoric, where it seems to me that the conceptual innovation idea has gone wrong. It's been misused or abused, and what we have is the risk of a bad argument, or at least a bad expression of a good argument. Something has gone wrong with the relation between that which is purely conceptual and that which we might consider to be factual. And there will be some examples of all these as we go. And we'll start with the great god Terminus, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you, or at least those of you who work in terminology, because Terminus was, of course, the god of boundaries and borders. He really would be the official mascot of the conference, you might say, and we are trying to, perhaps, to move him. Now, the point about Terminus, who in Roman and the ancient mythology was symbolized as a stone marking the boundary between 2 fields, 2 territories, okay? And the idea about Terminus is that he is not easily moved. This motto, concedo nulli, I give way to nobody. I stand my ground. And there is a wonderful legend, which I got off the internet, as one gets stuff off the internet, that apparently King Tarquin wanted to build a great new temple to Jerusalem, to Jupiter, on the remains of some old holy site, but this meant moving all the old shrines to the gods that were there before in order that the new temple could be built. So they consulted all the gods. Is it okay if we move your shrine 100 meters down the road in order that we can build our new territory, our new temple? And all the gods said yes, but Terminus said no, you're not moving my shrine. And he refused. And apparently his shrine remains in the new temple to Jupiter. Why do I keep saying Jerusalem? To Jupiter that was built anyway in the legend. So, I will start with the first kind of how we create new categories. I've got a class of 4 here. New categories. We make a new category for a new phenomenon, and we claim that this is useful. And I'm going to call these platypus categories. You know a platypus, I'm sure. Here he is. And I even looked up the Danish, but I couldn't work out how to pronounce it, so I gave that up. Right? Danish for a platypus. Anyway, I thought I had it right, but obviously it's not quite right. I'm still working on my pronunciation. Yeah. Well, you're more or less right. Okay. Now, the idea of this is that when apparently the first platypus was discovered, the zoologists had no idea what to call it or where to place it. It couldn't be fitted into any of the taxonomies that were available at the time. And so what they had to do was to make a new category to put it into. And they gave it a new name, which platypus means flat foot. So it's a flat-footed animal which has a duck-like bill. So in English, it's the duck-billed platypus. So that seems to me to be a model for one kind of conceptual innovation. You find something which is genuinely new, and you give it a name, and then it has a new place all of its own in your system. And I rather like these, and I'm going to give you a few examples from translation studies. But occasionally I want to point out that there may be some problems with some of these examples because of the cost that you pay in order to have a new thing here. So you can add your own to this list, because this is a very short list. There must be hundreds and hundreds more. These are some that have occurred to me or come before me in the last year or so, and I quite liked. And here is one by Perez Gonzalez. He proposes the new concept of an adhocracy, which is a word I really like, to describe temporary groups which are formed for a particular online project, and then they disband again, and so on. It's a very nice term, I think, but there is a cost to it, because one wonders how on earth you're going to get this rather jokey pun, as it were, aristocracy, adhocracy, and so on, ad hoc. You can see how it means what it means. It's an ad hoc group. How are you going to translate this into all the other languages in which we might want to use it? It might not come out as being quite so witty, so it might not be a good term. I'm not sure. An example, I think, of a platypus concept. New idea, a new phenomenon, these ad hoc groups of online translators, so you give it a new name. Fan subbing is another. I'm sure you all know more about that than I do. I think it's a useful coinage for a new practice, and one that can obviously be studied as a kind of translation. Scanlation. Do you do scanlation or possibly scanslation? Apparently this is used to describe scanning and translating and editing comics. It's a rather special field. And so it's a new field, it's a new phenomenon, you've discovered it, it's your platypus, and you give it a name. Okay, fine. Transfiction is a rather different sort of platypus concept. I think this is a rather an interesting idea too, where you are gathering together a whole lot of phenomena which have existed perhaps for some time, but you are now grouping them for the first time as something which can be studied as a separate subject, a separate topic. So transfiction is a word that refers to any kind of fictional representation of translators and interpreters. And I think that's a very nice idea. It groups together a possible area of research, and indeed there have been more publications on this in recent years. Here's another one, translation entropy, one I came across in a very different field, dealing with the new applications of technology to translation work. And this is a term that really brings in something from statistics and mathematics and physics, even if you go to entropy. And apparently it refers to the probability of a given target language item being selected for a given source text item. And you can measure this. If you're into machine translation, this is one of the things you do, I'm told. It's not my field at all. One of the things you can do is to measure the translation entropy of different possible items, and then you can derive various empirical hypotheses from this, depending on which group of translators you're studying and so on. If it's a new term to you, then go Google. I will give you some references at the end, and you can ask if you need them later. That, for me, was a whole new phenomenon, a new concept, a new idea, Although it did remind me of Catford's translation rules. I think it's a modern version of an older idea, but I thought it was quite an interesting and productive idea. Translatorship is another. And this introduces the first example of a case where we might have a kind of problem, which I've discussed a little bit with Olti Palokos-Polski in an email exchange earlier. I first came across this term in one of her papers dealing with the history of translators, where you have the term is used to describe the ordinary profession, the normal profession of somebody who also has translated. So the person might be an academic or a teacher or a minister of the church, and then also they have been doing translations. So it refers in that work to the kind of profession that a translator might have, apart from being a translator. But the problem here a little bit is that the term has also been used in a slightly different sense by other scholars. Janssen and Wegener, for example, refer to the different agents that are involved in producing a translation, the different members of a translatorship kind of team, publishers, editors, and so on, produced in marking it. And I was very interested in Olti's email that she sent to me on this point. She said maybe translatorship is an example of a term and a concept which is still somehow flexible and fuzzy, and it hasn't sort of settled into an accepted meaning, a generally accepted meaning. So you could say that it's we are seeing the birth, perhaps, of a new conception, a new concept. I thought that was very interesting indeed in terms of innovation. So the idea is that this is a case which you could say isn't something that comes just like that, adhocracy, like we had before, but it's an idea of a term which appears to have occurred to several people simultaneously, and a concept which begins by being two rather different concepts, and maybe they then merge. I'll come back to that idea in a few minutes. This is the second sense of the word in Janssen and Wegener's work. So I wonder what will happen to the term translatorship. Another example of what I call the platypus concept is the translation space idea. Originally, this was coined, I think, by Michael Cronin and Cheryl Simon, maybe too. The idea that you can look at a particular site, a geographical site like a city, where a translation takes place, and you can go around and see evidence of translation in this area. And so you are looking at translation as it exists in a certain geographical territory, which I think is very interesting. However, it's also been used in, again, a slightly different sense, which I find even more interesting, by a Finnish colleague of mine, Pekka Kujamäki, who looks at it, who uses the term to mean an area where we assume that translation must have taken place or must take place, but we can't seem to see it very clearly. And you have to go and look for it. And he has been researching, for example, the work of interpreters during wartime. And it takes quite an effort to discover evidence of interpreters' work during wartime. You have to go to all kinds of old photographs and documents and all kinds of things. It's not immediately evident that here we have interpretation or translation. And I also notice, as some of you may know, that there is a new journal, which I believe you're on the board of, Anthony? Well, of course, that's nothing new. What is Anthony not on the board of? Called Translation Spaces, which is interested in exploring this idea of marking out research areas which are of interest to translation scholars, actually which are geographically somehow bounded. I think that's a very fruitful research field. So that was the first group, okay, the platypus categories. What will happen to them, the platypus concepts? Will they last? Which ones will last? Where there is something really new, it seems to me, and it's been given a name or a new grouping or something. Now we move on to the next two groups, which I will treat more or less together, which are the splitters and the lumpers. If you are into lexicography, you will know that a splitter is a certain kind of lexicographer originally who likes having lots of different entries for different senses of the same word. So you have table meaning 1, table meaning 2, table meaning 3, and they're all different entries. And then you have the lumpers who think that all the ideas, all the meanings of table are really examples of the same big table meaning. And then you have it all in one big thing with table this, table that, and they're all grouped together. And the idea, I'm sure, is familiar to you. And, well, the splitters, of course, are focusing on the differences between the meanings, and the lumpers, who lump them together, are focusing on the similarities. And we have some wonderful examples, of course, outside translation studies. My favorite is Pluto, which used to be a planet, and then all the astrologers got together, not the astrologers, the astronomers, sorry. Too early in the morning, it's really. Astronomers got together and decided that no, Pluto is too small and it doesn't fulfill certain other criteria. It's not going to be a planet proper. It's going to be a dwarf planet. And I feel for Pluto on this. I think this is tough fate. So in other words, they make a split between planets and little planets, which are kind of not proper planets. So we have like Jacobson, we have translation proper, and we have other things. It's a similar kind of attitude. Okay, this is a splitting attitude. On the other hand, you have the lumpers, who like similarities. And my favorite example of a lumper is the wonderful Gaia Hypothesis. I'm sure you are familiar with that. The idea that we can consider the planet that we live on as one unit. And therefore, if we do this, then we see all kinds of things that we might not otherwise notice because we see it as a whole, and the planet looks after itself. And if it's really hot in Aarhus today, it's because the planet is organizing itself, and etc. An interesting thought occurred to me as I was preparing this lecture is a hypothesis that could be tested, which we can actually briefly now test, I suppose. It would be quite fun. I have this hypothesis that in translation studies, there are more splitters than lumpers. Now, put up your hand if you are a splitter. Nobody. One, we have a splitter in the front and one over here. Oh, my hypothesis is hereby rejected. Put up your hands if you are a lumper. The lumpers have it, clearly. Okay, so rejection of hypothesis. Thank you. That's science always moves forward, you know, by rejecting bad hypotheses. Okay. Now, let us look at some examples from translation studies. The point, okay, I've forgotten to say one thing, which is splitters and lumpers really raise the question of what is there empirical evidence for that we should split rather than lump, or lump rather than split? What are the facts? Is the thing that is being split or lumped, is it a natural kind? I don't think this is perhaps a relevant argument because we're dealing with concepts. The point should be the one that I made at the very beginning of this talk, which is consider what the pros and cons are of being able to take a very general view versus taking a more specific view. It's a question of the scope of the claim that you are trying to make. So, apart from being an advert for the Fiskars Finnish axe, which is of course the best axe in the world, made in Finland, yes, here are some examples. We have, of course, a long tradition of binary distinctions in TS. We have Juliana Haus's famous split between the translation and the version. The version is a translation which is culturally filtered, if I get that right, which is her way of splitting. And it's an example of, I think, a nice idea because it divides two different sorts of translation. But I think there is a cost here, which is that it reduces the area of the territory called translation. The things which are versions are no longer then translations. And the same sort of thing comes up with Guth's division between interpretive and descriptive use. You may remember, those of you that have studied relevance theory, that for Guth, it's only the interpretive use examples which he counts as translation, when you are interpreting what somebody else has said. But if you have descriptive use, for example, multilingual product descriptions, where you are describing the same product in a different language for a different audience, for him, this is outside the range of translation. And I think that too makes translation rather small, because many translators are, of course, also involved in descriptive use. So there's a cost to be paid for these distinctions. And here's another one which came to my attention recently, which is extremely interesting, but there is a cost to be paid here. I don't know whether you have met the term cislation yet. I know Brian Mossop has, because he's written about it, which is one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up here, because it's interesting. Goodrich argued, I think first, before Brian Mossop, that cislation should be distinguished from translation, and he gave cislation a very specific meaning, the meaning that it is carrying the reader to the source text. In other words, for Goodrich, cislation is a term used to describe very source-oriented translation, very literal in a special sense, literal translation, carrying the reader right to the source text, making the reader aware of the source text. And translation is the other. Here we have another example of a case like translatorship, where the same term has come up, used by another scholar, with a different sense. Because in a recent article, Brian Mossop uses cislation, suggests cislation as a term meaning intralingual translation, about which we shall hear a great deal more during this conference. As you know, there is a panel on this. This, of course, has a cost to be paid, because if you limit translation to interlingual translation, and you introduce a new concept for intralingual, and you call it cislation, then the cost that you pay is that the range of the boundary of the term translation is smaller. You cut off a corner and call it something else. Now, I repeat my main point. It's not whether or not this is empirically good or bad. It's a question of which is more useful for a given purpose. Are you interested in looking at what makes intralingual translation different from interlingual, or are you interested in what they share? Another example comes from Michael Schreiber's work on translation strategies. He has a very interesting and good distinction, I think, between what he calls Übersetzung and Bearbeitungen. So Übersetzung is when you are working to get the optimum equivalence with the source text. Brian Mossop calls this equivalencing. And then there's Bearbeitungen, which is what you do when you are trying to polish the target text, not relating it to the source, but relating it to its purpose. So he reckons that these are two big activity types that translators are involved in. And I think the idea is really good. I'd be interested to see research on how translators divide their time between working on getting equivalence and working on polishing the target, which is the Bearbeitung and the kind of polishing side of this. But why call the first type Übersetzung? Because this suggests that Bearbeitungen is not Übersetzung. It's something else. So again, we have paid a price. We have made our concept of Übersetzung, translation, smaller. And we've called the other stuff, which is the polishing of the target text, something which is not Übersetzung. And that seems to me to be counterintuitive. I think they're both Übersetzung, but there are two different things that we do within it. Another example a recent paper by Valdeón talks about the difference between stable and unstable source texts. I think this is a fascinating idea. It's a split now between two different sorts of source texts, some which remain stable, others which shift, like medieval manuscripts, or these days like many internet source texts or committee texts, where you have the source text which moves and lives as it's being translated. And for him, for Valdeón, this appears to be a kind of black and white distinction, but really I think it must be more fuzzy than that. But the idea, I think, of making this split between different sorts of source texts is quite interesting. Then there are a few lumper ones I'd like to just give you. And this one, of course, is one of the oldest, given to us by our German colleagues. Transaktionswissenschaft, as a lumper concept including both translation and interpreting. This answers your problem, Helle, that you mentioned, of keeping them separate. So a lumper concept is useful when you're looking to find the generalities between those two. I think also I would put the word text here. Nowadays we use the word text in a sense which is far more expansive than it would have been used 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 30 years ago. Nowadays a text is any form of any message in any medium and so on. It doesn't have to be verbal. So we have expanded it to include a great many other things. I think that allows us to make much more general hypotheses than we would have made before. My next two examples come from work on so-called translation universals. People have looked at to try to see what generalizations can be made about translations in general. And then there have been scholars who have pointed out maybe these things that we discover, tendencies in translations in general, are actually more general than that. They are not just found in translation, but in other kinds of communication. And one such proposal is the one that they are found in any kind of constrained communication. There's an article there by Landschak and Helthai that introduces that term. References come later if you need them. And other people have talked about mediated discourse, that what we think of as being universals of translation, possibly, they're really universals of a broader range of text types than simply translations. So it's an attempt to go above the category of translation into a more general category, lumping translation with something else. Another example, very different indeed, is Robinson's book of a few years back on sway. I don't know how many of you will have read this, Douglas Robinson's book. This is a book that groups together research into all the possible kinds of influences that impinge upon translators' decisions. Norms, temperament, temperature in the room, whether you're wearing a tie or not, anything can influence what you decide to do in your translation. And Robinson puts all these under the heading of sway. And then he takes us back to the origins of the use of this term in somebody else's work. I forget the details now. And for him, this is a good way to group together a whole lot of very, very, very different things. For me, when I read it, it didn't work. I didn't think that the concept was justified. The higher level concept was justified. There were too many differences for me. For him, it did work. And we're not dealing with empirical facts, we're dealing with, are you persuaded or not that this is a useful way to group together things and make generalizations at a rather general level, a high level of abstraction about different kinds of influences. Another example is voice, which has come into fashion recently, quite interestingly. In several studies that have come to my attention. There are research projects going on this in various places. And the characteristic which is shared by this kind of research is that there is a move to put together into one category, voice, aspects of translation or translator work which have previously been thought of as being rather different. So that voice, in the way it's used in this project, now seems to put together two senses of the word voice that we had before. The idea, first of all, that there are different voices in any given text, the Bakhtin's heteroglossia idea. So voices within a text. And then we bring into this the idea that any translation is the result of different agents' voices. The editor, the translator, the this, the that, the publisher, and so on. These are all people involved in producing the text. And they do this because they think that they can find interesting similarities between these two senses of voice, and they can then look and test hypotheses which cover both sorts of voice, you might say. This is a very interesting example of a lumping approach, I think. Let us see whether it will catch on and prove to be a lasting innovation. Another example is from Gut again. Gut would like to see translation theory put inside communication theory. We don't need a translation theory at all. We can just have a proper communication theory and it will include translation. So translation disappears, more or less. That's the ultimate lump, you could say. And we just have communication. And a recent book, which I have not read, but I read a review of it by Marais. I found the review by Sandra Halverson absolutely fascinating, but I have not read the book. This argues that translation should be simply studied as part of all kinds of intersystemic relationships. And it makes quite big terms about this. Apparently, where do I have it here? I seem to have lost my place in my text, but never mind. But Marais seems to be arguing that scholars should be studying a much wider range of things, all kinds of intersystemic relations, not just translations. And an example from one of my own research students in Finland, who has argued that we ought to include interspecies translation as well. She's been researching the way in which bird song is translated into verbal descriptions in literature, for example. And she's used translation terminology and concepts in order to analyze people's reactions to bird song. And she says this is all part of translation. It's big, big, big translation, including all the interspecies stuff. I found it totally fascinating. She's a lumper, so we have... and it occurs to me, and that this is perhaps the most serious of these examples, translation itself is a lumper concept. It's a huge mess, a heterogeneous lump of stuff. And we put it all under the same heading because we can then meet at conferences like this and discuss all possible bits and pieces that belong to it. And maybe it's not a natural kind at all. Well, so what? It doesn't have to be a natural kind. It's a way of grouping together things that we all find interesting. I think translation is a very good example of a lumper concept. Last example is rebranding. Of the last example of these ways of creating new categories like this. With rebranding, what you do is you take something which already exists and give it a new name, which then allows it to have different associations and a different, you see it differently. So as soon as we begin to call translation studies an interdiscipline, we see it differently from when it used to be called just a discipline, or was it ever a discipline? Well, we know now that we are an interdiscipline, don't we? Yeah, we do. Don't we? Yeah, we do. You're not sure? I think we're an interdiscipline. All right. Localization, another example, but a terrible cost. If you ask the localizers, do they do translation? Oh, translation is only a tiny, tiny, tiny part of what we do. The rest of what we do is creation and all kinds of other things. So to call the big thing localization and the small thing inside localization translation means that you see translation as something very small. And the same is true, I think, of transcreation. If you say, we do transcreation, we in the marketing world, we do transcreation, and as a student told me, if I can call my work transcreation, they pay me 3 times as much. Because this involves special creativity, thinking of the needs of the reader, the aim and so on. And if you ask an ordinary translator, do you ever think of the needs of the reader? Do you think you're creative? And most people would say, yes, of course I'm creative. Most translators assume that they are being creative as they translate. So the cost of calling what you do transcreation is that you reduce the value of the creativity of people who are doing ordinary translation, not translation, transcreation. And I think that cost is very high. I'm interested to see what people in the transcreation panel think about this. Universals is another one. When universals became a very popular term in translation studies, looking for these very general tendencies, we all followed Mona Baker at the beginning and we called them universals. I put them in quotation marks there, because really what she was saying is, wait for your own field. A rather nice example here is the way in which translation has been borrowed by the Scandinavian institutionalists. Now, you won't know about the Scandinavian institutionalists, probably, and nor do I much, but this was brought to my attention by a Finnish scholar who pointed out to me some time ago that there is a group of sociologists who study business communication called these institutionalists, and they're interested in the way in which ideas about how to manage organizational change, how they move from one company to another or one country to another. And people used to say, apparently, we are studying the diffusion of ideas from one place to another. And nowadays, this group of people say we are studying the translation of ideas from one place to another, because for them, translation has this positive connotation of being creative and new and interesting and dynamic. It's not just diffusion, it's something bigger and more beautiful, it's translation. So that's kind of nice. So we are being used here to rebrand something else. Second chunk, fairly short, this chunk, is to remind you that when we try to make some conceptual innovation by introducing some as, seeing translation as something, we are dealing with interpretive hypotheses, as usual, where we are arguing that a given way to interpret something, to see something, is more useful than some other concept. You test these claims according to how useful they are, not against the truth criterion. A nice quote from the Guardian Weekly from last year that talks about Einstein's relativity theory, about which I'm sure we all know a great deal. The innovation, according to this article, was that Einstein treats gravitation not as a force, but as a distortion in the geometry of space and time. And there you have it. This is the hermeneutic as, that you understand something by comparing it or seeing it as something else. Well, what do we see translation as? We have our million famous metaphors, repacking a suitcase, transfer, and all the rest of them, which I won't go into now. But what are the pros and cons? What is highlighted and what is overlooked about these ways of seeing? And of course, other things can be seen as translation. Dawkins raises a problem. This is the famous anti-God Dawkins, who also happens to be a naturalist. He argues that one of our problems when we try to understand the world is that things which are naturally actually a continuum, we tend to break up into little bits, and we tend to see the individual elements in a continuum. We don't realize that it is really a continuum. For example, are we living in the Anthropocene period? In other words, we are making such a mess of the planet that we ought to call it something different, or is there just a continuation of what the life has been like before? An interesting point of view, I think. And one of the things that happens here is that we get bad arguments. I want to spend 10 minutes or so on this before we open up for questions. there is a risk of confusion that conceptual innovation is misused. And I want to show you, first of all, some ways in which it's misused and misunderstood, leading to bad argument. And then I'll give you some examples. And all the examples are anonymous, except one. Except two, actually. So, if you say, for example, there are 2 or 17 kinds of translation, that looks as if you are making an empirical claim. I have studied my data, and here are my 3 things that I have found. But in fact, it's not, of course. It's an interpretation. What this really means is I see translation as consisting of 3 different kinds, or 2 different kinds. It's not a fact, it's an opinion. It's not a fact, it's an interpretation. And sometimes the rhetoric hides this, especially if you're trying to be innovative. You know factive verbs, verbs like point out and show. If you use those, they suggest that it is accepted that it is a fact, what you're saying. If I say, he pointed out that the earth was flat, you would think I was very strange, because we all know, I guess, that the earth is not flat. If you say, he argued that the earth was flat, that's a grammatical sentence. You might think I was a bit crazy, but it's a grammatical sentence. If you say he pointed out that the earth was flat, there's something grammatically wrong about that sentence because of the clash between the factive assumption of point out and the fact that we know that the earth is not flat. There's a semantic clash. But sometimes people use this distinction wrong, and they make a claim which sounds like a conceptually innovative claim, and then you have to stop. Here is one that occurred to me recently, that somebody, anonymously, points out, and I expect a fact to follow, that concepts are essentially theories about ontology. Well, is this a fact? I would say, well, that's an interesting argument, an interesting way of looking at the concept. Is it true or not? Do I agree with it? Do I not? It's not an obvious fact. And I think this is an example of risky rhetoric. Here's another example where you mix up a definition which is actually temporary or stipulative, specific to you, as a factual or lexical one that you might find in a dictionary. If you see, as I have often seen in student papers, translation is defined as X, as if this was a universally acknowledged fact, rather than saying, I define translation like this in this study because this and this and this. I think there are often confusions between these 2 kinds of definition. I once wrote myself, translation is something that people do with words. That was supposed to be a witty introduction to a paper. It was not supposed to be a definition. And a colleague of mine came up to me afterwards and said, this is a terrible definition of translation. And I thought, oh no, have I expressed myself so badly that she thought it was a definition? Okay, so risky rhetoric on my part there. Now here are a few examples. I had a student who, after my memes book came out, emailed me from the other side of the world and said, have you found any new super memes recently? As if the super memes were empirical things that I would go out and find. She completely missed the point. Obviously, either she'd misunderstood or my rhetoric had been bad. Somebody else argues, this translation strategy is wrong because it goes against Skopos theory. Now, there's an innovation that's been missed here. It's been concealed. Because what she should have argued would have been, this data that I have here, the translators are doing this and this, is actually data against Skopos theory. She'd misunderstood the relation between the conceptual claim, the conceptual theory, and the empirical situation. Here's one that came up recently. I'm going to very carefully make it anonymous. Some people still resist the post-structural view of meaning as something negotiated and interpreted rather than transferred. Meaning, of course, we all know, don't we, that the post-structural view of meaning is the only correct, empirically true version. Nonsense, I say to myself. This is an interpretation. It's a view of something. Why put it like this? It's very, very misleading rhetoric. Other people have argued that you can only make sense of the world by construing it as narrative. It's not true. It's an interpretation of what a good way to interpret the world. It's not a truth. Somebody else has argued that because of the position taken by a particular philosophy, certain things should be done. Well, only if you agree with that philosophy. It doesn't logically follow. A Skopos critic argues that the Skopos should not be seen as essential in the translation process. Whoops. How do you mix an as and a should? Okay, an as is an interpretation. You try to argue that it's a good interpretation. You can't argue that we should adopt it or we must adopt it. You can try to persuade us. We look at the evidence for and against. Here's one which I now give a citation for. I thought it was really quite funny. One should never take the meaning of a technical artifact or technological system as residing in the technology itself, as, I'll underline. Instead, one must study how the technologies are shaped and acquire their meaning in the heterogeneity of social. Well, this is a point of view. It's not an empirical fact. I think there is confusion between a claim that might be an innovative claim. Let us look at technology in this way and see what we find. Let us treat it as this and see whether we can find some interesting generalizations to be made. So, what do we learn? This is my sort of summing up slide. So we have some time for some questions. And there is my good friend on the right. And there is my favorite question to all, everybody. So what? You're making a claim. What will follow from this claim? How do you know that this claim is more useful than some counterclaim, etc., etc., etc.? I think in translation studies, we do not test our interpretive hypotheses anything like enough. They are proposed, and then we all run away and use them, but we don't actually test them. What is the cost of these conceptual innovations that we are proposing, and what are the benefits of these innovations that we are proposing? Is there really an added value? What might the added value might be? Here are some possible added values, obviously. I think we should give more attention to these sorts of things. And what are the consequences for the status of the existing concepts? What will happen to them? Are we actually making translations smaller if we make certain sorts of conceptual innovations? What will it mean for existing conceptions of translation? Why would this be better than what we already have? We are not critical enough, I think, of the purely conceptual innovations that are proposed. And, well, watch out for careless argument, as I just tried to show. Those are some references which are frightfully small. Can you read them at all? You probably can a little bit. If anybody needs more details on the references or those, or you can't read them, then come up and grab me and I'll show you what they are. So I'll stop there, and we have 10 minutes or so for some queries. Thank you for your attention. I can go back and leave that up there. Oh, wait a minute, it's gone. Oh, no, it hasn't gone. No, wait a minute, I would leave that one there so people can see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great.
You want to share the question?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Andrew. Very enlightening. We have time for questions, comments. Surely there must be questions. Oh, there is one. Why did I not? This place is too big. Hello, Jan. Okay, so I know who you are, but could you please say your name? Just
right. Yes, I'm Jan Pedersen of Stockholm University. Thank you very much, Andrea. This was brilliant as always. I've sort of want to ask your opinion on, not your facts, but your opinions on the last bit about risky rhetoric. Some of us sometimes feel that we live in a world which is ever more relativistic and where opinions and facts are being relativized and mixed and people can't tell the difference between the two. Do you think that this is becoming part of translation studies as well, so that we see more of this risky rhetoric now than we used to before, or is this like a constant thing?
I've no idea how to answer that. I've not made any kind of historical study. No,
but you've been around for a long time, so.
I'll see you afterwards on that one. I took the examples from works which have come across my desk in the last 5 years or so, because since retiring I've been doing quite a lot of refereeing and reviewing, and when one does those things one has really to be critical, because that's what one is there for. And I have kind of begun to collect some of these examples of people who present opinions as if they were facts. I have no idea whether this has increased or not. I don't think it has increased. For example, I think it's always been there. And a much older example, which I didn't give now, is a famous case of, you remember in Antoine Berman's classic book on, or his classic article on retranslation. Some of you may know this, where he argues that first of all, there are two kinds of translation. There are great translations, and there are not great translations. And then he says, well, in order to be a great translation, it has to be a retranslation. The first time anything is translated, it can never be a great translation. And this is presented as if this was an eternal truth. And it's always made me think, well, hang on now, what's the evidence? What's the counter-evidence? Why do you have this opinion? And so on. Of course, it's not a truth, and it's easy, if it's a claim supposed to be empirical, it's easy to prove it wrong. That it's not a universal truth. So there is I think the risk has always been there, and I hope that we are now more aware of it than maybe we were before. I don't know.
I take comfort in that. Thank you.
Yes, Isabel.
Thank you for a very mind-stimulating introduction. All these are topics that have been bothering me for quite some time. I'm sorry, my name is Vassos Giannakopoulou from the University of Cyprus. The question is, what I think the discrepancy lies here is between delimiting the concept of translation per se, and as opposed to translation studies and what translation studies can include. So I understand a concern to all encompass everything under the blanket term of translation in order to be able to address topics like adaptation, intersemiotic translation, localization. You can go on and on. Would you agree, or rather, okay, I'll rephrase. Would you see as translation studies as being able to address all those interdisciplinary fields without necessarily calling all that stuff translation?
Yes, I would.
Thank you.
I don't see a problem there. Is not what you call something is not so important. What is important, I think, are the claims and hypotheses that you can make. Whatever you call them, if you don't want to call it translation, call it bananas if you prefer. That's fine. I don't think that matters, but it might make it difficult for your readers if you talk about bananas. I don't know, but no, I don't think the term is the point. The point is, ultimately, what are the claims being made, and the hypothesis and the generalizations being proposed, and how might they increase our understanding of the world around us, and this particular corner of it that we're interested in? I don't think the actual names matter so much. Somebody in the front, yeah? You're next. Okay.
Okay.
You go first. Then you come.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. Claire Vassallo, University of Malta. Coming to translation from semiotics is another perhaps lumpen way of looking at the discipline, because through semiotics, translation is simply how we make sense of things, how we understand. And I think that's also one of the ways in which the term translation has broadened in its use recently. We keep hearing the word to translate as to understand, and I think that's really positive for the discipline and for what we're about. So I don't perhaps all these different aspects of translation, adaptation, they're all sort of, yes, breaking down the concept, breaking it down into different ways, but all under the general heading of translation, as in making sense and transferring sense. And if we do it from one language system to another, from visual to verbal and so forth, I think it's still the same principle of translation, of making sense, of understanding, under the heading of semiotics, which I actually see as sort of broader.
I agree. I mean, I could have indeed included semiotics. It's one of the great lumping disciplines, isn't it? Yeah, I agree. You can certainly see it that way.
Riham Abdel Masood, Alex University. I'm interested on whether you view that kind of expansion of the boundaries of translation part of the current interest in expansion of culture, or at least understanding of culture, because somehow when I see that all those terms and the boundaries they push, it's always underneath that pushing of boundaries is a desire for understanding the culture, or at least the culture turn has pushed that boundaries to the extent that we're viewing translation as a means to understanding the word or the different cultures of the word. This is because what I have in mind is that in connection to what you were saying, how we understand the word and how we is very much bound to the need to the new culture orientation in the human science. Do you agree with that or not? Because
there's clearly a relation between the two. I mean, if you push translation boundaries, what we would call translation, or what we can study as translation, if you make that bigger, then clearly you are also pushing cultural boundaries and concepts of culture at the same time. The terms are very closely related. Yes, I do agree with that. I don't see that there's a problem, but yes, clearly that's happening. Yeah. I think there may be more. I think there's more than one driving force. I don't think it's just a question of politics or cultural politics. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew, for a very inspiring lecture. My name is Rene Meijlers from Leuven. I have the idea, it's not an hypothesis, it's an idea, that your lecture was based on a specific idea of what is doing good science. Could you perhaps expand what, in your opinion, or idea or hypothesis or whatever, what is your vision of doing good science related to everything what you said?
Well, that's how long have I got? That's a rather big question. Let me answer it this way in order to be relatively brief. I think one of the central criteria of doing good science in whatever field within, humanities or physics or whatever, is to be critical, to be rigorous, to be systematic, and so on. And I would say that we need to be aware of the difference between, if I put it simply, facts and opinions. I know that the concept of a fact can be queried, and facts what is taken to be a fact now may no longer be taken to be a fact, generally speaking, in 100 years' time, and so on and so on. But still, I would say perhaps respect for evidence, too, would be, and for counter-evidence, the power of counter-evidence, both as a counter-argument and counter-evidence in an empirical sense. You see so many claims put forward in the name of broadening translation studies, which provide all kinds of evidence in favor, and no attention paid to possible counter-evidence, for example. I think that's not good science. To sum up a concept of science very briefly is, I think, too big a task for me at the moment. But perhaps I might ask you back: is there some concept of science which you have, which you find does not fit in with what I have been trying to talk about? Do you want to answer that, or is that something for coffee afterwards? That's for coffee afterwards. I'm not allowed to ask questions. No, dear. Okay.
I'm sorry, but this is the final question that we have up here.
Thank you. My name is Eva Sherwood. I'm from the Queen's University of Belfast. I'd like to ask you about your final point, the point you made. I found it quite interesting that you didn't question that coming up with new conceptual innovations has an added value. But you also said that we are not critical enough of our ideas, or that we don't test them enough. My sort of question is, why do you think we don't test them or are not critical enough? And if we don't test them, where is the added value of those ideas?
Okay. If we don't test the ideas, and if they're not tested by others in use, if they don't turn out to be useful, then I think they don't have added value. I think one reason why we propose conceptual innovations without testing them in terms of their usefulness, I repeat, not in terms of whether they are true or false. That's not the correct criterion. They're not empirical things. It's a question of how useful they are. It's pragmatic testing. The reason we don't do it as much as we should might be the pressures on publication. We are all supposed to be publishing very fast. If you're working on a doctorate, you have to do something innovative, and so on, so on, so on. We are pushed to be innovative. We are not pushed to be critical. We're not pushed to test. We're pushed to be innovative. The system seems to be somehow unbalanced in that respect, I think. And partly, but maybe because we're too lazy, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know why we don't test enough. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we do test enough. Maybe it's just my picture that we don't test enough.
Okay.
It's only an opinion.
Okay, I'm so sorry we don't have time for any more, but should we give Andrew a hand? Thank you very much. It was so extremely interesting. There is enough to discuss. Just a few practical questions while you're leaving the room. You will find coffee not just outside here, but on all 3 floors. So don't just go to the first coffee station. It's all over. There's a poster session. Afterwards, there's a poster session, and posters are on display on the 1st and 2nd floors, so this floor and the one below. Please note that there will be a Best Poster Award, and that all of you, must vote for, this is not an opinion, it's a fact. You must vote for the poster that you think is best. This is how we find it. And information on how to vote is posted in lobbies and hallways in this building, and it's of course also available on the Congress website. Then just please note that after the poster session we go for lunch, and it's not served in this building. So find a student helper in a red t-shirt, they'll take you to the right place. The same goes for tonight's reception. Just, follow the red t-shirt. So thank you very much for now. Enjoy your coffee and posters and lunch and everything.